and welcome back to Newsx. I'm Thomas Porteous and you're watching Focal Length, where we get you a briefing on topics from across the world. In this conversation, we will discuss various aspects of the incoming US President-elect Donald Trump's policies. We'll discuss his approach to tariff policy and how they will affect the economy, and how they will help contain China's economic growth. Are the heavy tariffs imposed on Chinese electric vehicles by the US and the EU justified? The recent New Orleans terror attack has shifted focus to immigration and Islamist terrorism. How closely are they linked? Is Islamist terrorism on the rise in the West? What are the potential impacts of Trump's stringent immigration policies and crime and radicalism? Will the Quad gain momentum under Trump 2.0? And with Xi Jinping's insistence on unifying Taiwan with China, is Taiwan prepared to defend itself? Trump has called for increased military spending. Could this lead to a warlike situation in the East China Sea? Let's find out. Joining us is Elizabeth from Larus, a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Global China Hub and Indo-Pacific Security Initiative. She is also a professor emerita of political science and former departmental chairman at the University of Mary Washington. With over 30 years of experience in analysing US, China and Taiwan's politics and foreign policies, Elizabeth regularly contributes to major outlets such as Al Jazeera, BBC and the Financial Times. She is the author of several influential works, including Politics and Society in Contemporary China and Economic Reform in China. Thank you, Elizabeth, for joining us. My first question to you is, what do you make of Donald Trump's tariff policy? Do you think it will benefit the economy?
I think it will certainly help with the job situation in the USA. The tariff policy and jobs were a big issue, of course, in the November 2024 election. And President Trump promised that he would impose tariffs, particularly on goods from China. And the argument is that subsidies to Chinese businesses are creating an uneven playing field for American businesses and American manufacturers. So by imposing the tariffs, the move is not so much to punish China as to make the situation better. So I believe in some ways what it will probably do is encourage businesses to leave China and either come to the United States or to go to US-friendly countries where they will not be subsidized. And also, hopefully, that'll bring jobs back to the United States. Although, of course, because wages are so much higher here, that's questionable. It will certainly raise some prices for Chinese goods imported into the US as well as US goods due to the tariffs.
Do you think the increased tariff policy against China will help US contain China's economic growth?
I do not believe that the purpose is to contain China. I believe the purpose is to help US manufacturers and to help US workers. It is extremely difficult for one country to contain another. That said, China's economy is having a lot of problems on its own. The tariffs that President Trump proposed very well might be an opening salvo of negotiations. President Trump, as a lot of China observers believe, that China cannot absorb such tariffs as its economy, the growth in its economy slows down, perhaps even enters a deflationary era, and that China will not want to bear the tariffs, so it'll come to the negotiating table to discuss reducing subsidies to their companies and other things, opening the market wider to American business, those types of things that have been a bone of contention between the United States and China, honestly, for decades.
Do you think heavy tariffs imposed on China's electric vehicles by the US and the EU are unwarranted?
They're certainly warranted because that is an industry that is heavily subsidized by the Chinese government, by the Chinese state. The tariffs will have an impact on imports of Chinese EVs into Europe. We will see fewer of them. However, the Chinese EV prices are very good, very competitive. And we don't get too many in the United States, so I don't think it'll affect the United States. What we will see then is probably a more aggressive move on China to export those heavily subsidized EVs, which are very low priced and very good quality, to less developed countries, the so-called global South, where there is a growing middle class. People want to buy cars, but the American and European models are too expensive. And so China will aggressively export to the less developed countries, which are hungry for those types of goods.
The New Orleans terror attack has brought the focus on immigration and Islamist terrorism. Do you think they're linked?
It appears right now that a lot of the terrorist attacks, at least in the US, are not associated with immigration. It appears more so in Europe. What we are seeing in Europe and possibly the United States is not the first generation, like the newcomer arrivals that are carrying out attacks. Very often it's the disaffected second generation that has failed to integrate into Western culture and civilization. Now, certainly, we have seen a rise in crime in the United States, and that is linked to illegal immigration. And of course, the number one issue in the November 2024 presidential and legislative elections was illegal immigration. And President Trump has promised a policy to greatly stem that flow. And we will see after his inauguration if he's able to execute that policy.
Do you think Islamist terrorism is on the rise in the West?
We do not see it on the rise in the United States. Much earlier this decade, or even in the early 2000s, there were more attacks. And the US government responded. The US government put a lot more intelligence on it. And so, thankfully, because of greater alertness, intelligence, the US government has been able to thwart some attacks. For example, there was a student at George Mason University up in Northern Virginia who was posting videos about making homemade, explosive devices and encouraging people to use them in mass attacks. Well, that was taken down. That person was arrested, detained. So we've also seen other cases in Texas like that. So thank goodness these people have not been able to carry out attacks, but the intelligence has to be very, very good and has to be working 24/7, 365 days a year, has to be very, very keen to prevent these things from happening.
What do you think of Trump's stringent immigration policy? Do you think it will help in fighting crime and radicalism?
I believe that Trump's proposed immigration policies will help cut down on crime. At least 40% of the crime in American cities is carried out by illegal immigrants. And the American people overwhelmingly, voted for President Trump to deal with that problem. So I believe that, honestly, he might run into a problem in some of the sanctuary cities where the mayors have said they would not cooperate with ICE, that is the immigration enforcement agency. So it is one thing to propose and then perhaps try to execute anti-illegal immigration policy. But if it runs up against significant barriers, that is a problem to implementation. But I do think that the American people have no patience for that type of thing anymore, and that those politicians who prevent Trump from carrying out a lot of his policies will probably be out of office at the next election.
Do you think the Quad will gain momentum under Trump 2.0?
They made some really good progress Under the Biden administration, Biden was quite focused on working with allies in the Indo-Pacific. I can remember several years ago, the Quad, the idea, the concept, even the implementation of the Quad was just dead. I do believe that it'll go forward, and that is because I'm looking at his cabinet picks. And the people that he selected so far that are would be like responsible for Quad, type activities are very interested in the Indo-Pacific. Marco Rubio as Secretary of State, but perhaps more Elbridge Colby, who would be Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, is very focused on the Indo-Pacific. So if you look at President Trump's cabinet picks, you can see that he is focused on the Indo-Pacific and key to maintaining the peace, security, status quo, security in the Indo-Pacific is the Quad.
Amid Xi Jinping's reiteration that Taiwan will be unified with China, is Taiwan prepared to defend itself? Trump has called for increased military spending. Is there a likelihood of a war-like situation arising in the East China Sea?
Taiwan is not prepared to defend itself. It has not been prepared for quite a long time. It would be difficult for Taiwan to defend itself when you look at the size, might, power, intention of China's military. It would be difficult for Taiwan to defend itself. We all know now that the best way for Taiwan to defend itself is to engage, embrace asymmetric warfare. And then it is actually purchasing more arms from the United States. Taiwan would certainly need the aid, help of the force aggregation of the United States, more likely Japan as well, U.S. bases perhaps in the Philippines. All of that needs to come together before Xi Jinping decides he wants to move on Taiwan. Of course, he has the intent, he has the desire, the intent, the means, increasingly ability to do so. And so the United States and the allies need to pick up the pace to deter China. That is to raise the cost so high that China decides not to try to take Taiwan. Regarding the East China Sea, that has been a problem for decades. It quieted down before Xi Jinping came into office, but since he's come in, he's been more aggressive. What I have noticed about Xi Jinping's approach toward taking the Diaoyu Islands, that is the Senkaku Islands, is it depends on who the prime minister is. When the prime minister and the ruling Liberal Democratic Party in Japan is strong, he backs off a bit. When it appears to be weak, that's when he is aggressive. And that's just classic military strategy. So Japan needs to have a very, very strong posture toward the East China Sea, again, to signal that they would defend the Senkaku Islands and to deter China by raising the cost so much that Xi Jinping blinks. That is, he thinks twice.
Thank you, Elizabeth Larus, for speaking to us on Focal Length. With that, it's a wrap on this episode. For more international news updates, stay tuned on Newsx.